Hi everybody, this is Eugene Bradley. I am the founder and CEO of the Silicon Valley Transit Users. Today we have video from the November 4th, 2021 Caltrain Joint Powers Board JPB meeting. Now Caltrain's Joint Powers Board consists of politicians from the three cities that Caltrain serves, that is San Francisco County, San Mateo County, and Santa Clara County. One thing of note in this particular JPB meeting was comments made by Mr. Walton, who serves on the JPB in San Francisco. Now, Shamann Walton, who will be speaking here, is also president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Note some of the comments and concerns he has regarding the future governance on how Caltrain is managed and how he wants it to be managed in the future. So please leave your comments in the video on what Mr. Walton said and how you would do to help make that happen. So enjoy the video and thank you.
I would refer to this step that's embodied in the Strongman proposal as an interim step. I think the resolution that the JPB adopted envisioned that ultimately the parties would come to a resolution that was satisfactory to the member agencies, and until that time, the JPB would continue to be subject to the constraints it imposed on itself, namely that it would require a supermajority or 6 votes to authorize the expenditure of more than $40 million in Measure RR revenue. So that restriction would remain in place until such time as the member agencies come together and agree to make amendments to the JPA. The other aspect of the resolution was that the delegation of authority by Samtrans to the JPB to appoint its own executive director was tied to the repayment of Samtrans' initial investment. So this would be a partial step towards a governance solution, but not the final step.
Okay, thank you.
Director Walton.
Thank you. Real quick, can we go back to the slide that says the interest amount that's owed to Samtrans?
We can go to the slide that talks about it, but Director Walton, the amount is still under discussion, so there is no amount
No need.
specified.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was actually my point. First of all, I don't know how we could agree to something without even knowing, the amount and what we would be agreeing on. I mean, that is probably fiscal management or responsibility 101. But I first of all just want to acknowledge the hard work of Director Bouchard and her entire team. I thank everyone who was actually committed to the governance work this past year. When we made the agreement to work on this, most of us took this work very seriously. I do have a lot of concerns about this proposal. One thing is the managing agency duties or roles are not understood across the board. The fact that Samtrans is delegating authority to the JPB is problematic from onset, which has always been an issue. But this proposal really is reflective of some of the problems with the current governance structure. It's not a proposal that addresses governance, in my opinion, with the spirit of what Resolution 2020-42 was about, as we had the conversations and discussions and came to a resolution to support Measure RR and the commitments we all made. This addresses one piece of what governance would be, but it definitely does not address governance. I just have to say this is very favorable towards Samtrans. It's agreement that I don't think is equitable for partner agencies, and quite frankly, ultimately, Caltrain. It's agreement that maintains Samtrans as the managing agency, and I think the spirit of the resolution was never the intent for that to continue in that direction. We have large projects like electrification, several grade projects, Measure RR in place. We don't have a complete accounting of how funds are cost allocated between Samtrans and Caltrain. So we don't know how much of Caltrain resources are being used to support Samtrans, if any, and that needs to be audited and identified. And as you all know, and we can agree to disagree, or we can maybe not all see things the same way, but there was definitely certain members of this body that love to talk about the 2008 agreement between agencies. And so I'm trying to understand the possibility of how this interest part of the agreement that was made in 2008 fell out of the sky, particularly when we all made commitments in 2008. We all made commitments as we had our conversations about the resolution in support of Measure RR. And so, you know, I definitely agree that we need to commit to a deadline for repayment. I will say that, but not by extortion from Samtrans, and not with added interest or new agreements that, you know, were created and developed in a back room somewhere. Caltrain decision-making needs to be solely in the hands of the JPB. All decisions, not just decisions around the CEO. All decisions for Caltrain need to be made by the JPB. I truly believe that's what we agreed to work on per resolution 2020-42. This governance process was undermined by members of this body and Samtrans when they went against the intent to change the governance structure that we all agreed on in support of Measure RR. Comments made by certain colleagues on the JPB, letters sent to agencies threatening to sue members of the JPB clearly provides insight to the fact that not everyone was operating in good faith and in accordance with the resolution. Undermining the governance process, in my opinion, has pushed us further from the ability to come to an agreement on this from my standpoint. And you know, I don't think that it's fair to the staff to be put in a position to come up with certain agreements that we should be working on as members of the JPB. And so again, I want to thank you so much, Director Bouchard, and thank your team so much for working to come up with some kind of resolution. But this does not address governance in the spirit of the resolution, in my opinion, and that is problematic for me.
Thank you, Director Walton. Director Hendricks.
Okay, so remind me, I never want to speak after Director Walton again, because I think he had some really powerful statements right there, and I hope I can try and be as eloquent. First off, on one of the slides, it talks about that it's affirming the general counsel and auditor and stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, we don't have an auditor yet. So I'd like to see us agendize, you know, it's not as part of this item, but agendize for a future soon meeting of when we will get the auditor function added. I think it was 2 meetings ago that we sent Michelle and her team off on what I thought was an impossible task of being able to try and come back with a proposal. And I do believe this is a starting point. I'm not going to say it's a good starting point, but I think it is a starting point for us to try and go ahead and look at. I don't want to try and, this is a document that was produced outside of a public meeting. And so I don't know that, I don't really want to try and negotiate line item by line item in a public meeting. But I do think we should continue to try and work on this outside of this meeting in going to our next one. But I want to lay out a couple areas or areas, objectives, goals of things I think that need additional look at as part of the document. First, the MOU versus something that's signed by all the agencies. I just need more clarity and better understanding of what that is. I think I have concerns that this limits the board's ability to hold the managing agency accountable. I think there needs to be more clarity on the hiring and firing of the GM, general counsel, and auditor language that's there. The whole repayment section, I think it just needs more clarity in the language, and I think particularly on the interest piece. If nothing else, if we're not going to put a number down, what is the set of criteria or parameters that somebody thinks is going to go into that discussion? And I do think we would need a number before we got to the end. is this agreement consistent with resolution 2020-42? I think there are parts of this that are not consistent, and we need to look at that. And then I don't know if it's actually in the language, but I'd like to be able to try and understand what is different between what is the historical versus our current practice versus the future of how what the managing agency does. You know, if the document changes what's been going on, can we articulate examples of what that changes is? And if things don't change, that'd be good to know too. So like I said, I'm very interested in continuing the work that's been done, that Michelle and her team reaching out to the general managers of the agency to try and work on this. I think there should be more reach out directly to board members to get their opinions of what's going on in this, to be able to try and continue to refine and move this to something that the majority of the board and potentially the agencies could agree to. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Director Hendricks. Director Heminger?
Thanks. Let me start, as many have, by thanking Michelle for volunteering to do this at the point of a gun. And one thing I like about it is that it is incremental. And I think incrementalism sort of gets a bad rap because everyone likes the home run ball, and but singles eventually add up to runs. And I think the fact that we are taking a slower, more methodical approach is actually suited to our circumstance, because we've got board members who have very strongly and sincerely held beliefs all over the map. And so I'm not sure there is a long ball here for all of us. So I started with something I like about it, and I think is a strength and is something that we can build off of. Let me also offer 3 comments in the various sections of this document where I hope we can make some improvement. The first one is in the affirmations and statements, and the one about regional governance. I do think it accurately reflects the conversation we had at our last meeting, but I was hoping we could do better. I think in 2 particular areas. One, to talk about Caltrain taking a leadership role and use that word instead of just saying we're going to be there to make sure we don't get the shaft. I think that'd be a good improvement. And secondly, and Michelle is liable to shoot me for this one, but I think one thing that has brought us this far this year is a deadline. And I think maybe having a deadline for bringing something back to the Joint Powers Board about regional rail governance might work twice. Now, obviously, we don't have anything that everyone's ready to sign off on, but I don't think we would be this far if we hadn't had that deadline. So those are my comments there. On the second part, which is the Caltrain Executive Director, I do have a question here, and that is the very last clause talked about the decision to hire the director shall be a supermajority, including at least 1 member appointed from each county. Am I reading that correctly, that if the counties voted in block on hiring person A, and 1 county in block voted against A because they wanted B, does that basically give a veto to each county in making that decision?
Yes, I think that would be a correct
Okay.
interpretation.
I have to say, I'm not sure I like it or dislike it, because if you're counting votes when you're hiring your director, you're in trouble because you want that to be a strong consensus across the board. But I do think it's worth perhaps reconsidering the notion of giving each county a veto. That's a lot of the reason that we're sort of in the soup we're in right now with the Joint Powers Agreement and this sort of rule of unanimity. So I think that's worth thinking about. And then finally, on the right-of-way repayment, as Director Walton said, it's hard to react to blanks for the interest. I will say most of the budgets I've seen around the Bay Area, and in fact, the one that Derek gave us this month, and he gives us one every month, he's making about 1% or less on our money. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot of interest out there to grab unless we're just going to assume 2 or 3 or 4% by fiat. But I again can't really react to anything there because the blank needs to be filled in. I do think we need something as a counterpart to this reversion idea, because the reversion happens if the money doesn't get paid back. I think we need some language that if the money does get paid back, that there's a release of claims. You know, one of the things we heard about during the year is that the amount of money owed on the right-of-way payment is like $100 million. It's $40 million. It's $80 million. And I think one thing we want to ensure is that if we finally do end up paying Samtrans their money, that they don't decide several years later to come back and ask for more. So I think some kind of release of claims on the right-of-way money, if it is paid, is appropriate. And I would conclude on that point.
Thank you, Director Heminger. Director Hendricks.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I need to say something, and I'm going to appear to be hypersensitive and stuff. And I know I use a lot of metaphors, but could I just ask all of us, if in all the metaphors we use, can we just please not use the "I'm going to shoot somebody" metaphor? I know what was meant, and
Which one? Which one? I don't understand.
that if a metaphor is used of, you know, if Steve, if he says something, Michelle might want to shoot him. I know I'm being very sensitive, and I think you guys can all.
Glenn, I appreciate that, and I apologize.
Yeah, I wasn't really trying to call you. I know you guys all understand why I might be hypersensitive to that. So I'm all for all the other metaphors, but if we can just be aware of that one, I'd appreciate it. And I wasn't really meaning to try and make a big deal, but thank you.
Thanks, Director Hendricks. Director Zamuda.
Yes, and I think that this is a project that still needs a fair amount of work, but I do feel like we're moving forward. I also have lots of questions about the interest calculation and how that's going to be done, and at what point are we going to be able to weigh in on that number and the methodology. And, you know, it might wind up being some kind of a negotiation, but nevertheless, I think that we need to know what that is before we would be in a position to agree upon that. So I don't know what your timetable is relative to that. With respect to shared services, I know that what you're writing up now reflects the current state. I think we need to take another look at that to see if there's any other shared services that we would like to change prior to making this agreement for, you know, a multi-year period. And I do believe that it's important to maintain every X number of year review as to whether or not we want to keep the shared services with Samtrans, or whether or not we would want to contract out or hire directly our own employees. And then with the, I'm not exactly sure which slide it was, but we talked about certain positions running through. And I don't like those words. I think that can just be stricken and saying that those positions report to the Executive Director of Caltrain, because I think that leaves some interpretation, misunderstanding, if there is a question related to what positions and what functions will report directly to the JPB. And then finally, then this is a comment. This is not perfect. This is not what my preference would be. However, I do think it is a much improved governance structure than what we have right now. And I do think that this is an iterative process and we're trying to meet a deadline. I would like to see the executive director of the JPB reporting directly to our board ASAP, particularly with all the other things that are very important for us to manage. And to the extent that we can continue to work toward a permanent governance structure, the better the train will be, and the better we'll be able to deliver services to the public.
Thank you, Director Zamuda. Ideally, we would get feedback from other directors. So I don't know if Director Pine or Director G, you have anything you'd like to add or offer?
Katie, this is Director G. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I would like to start with saying thank you to Michelle and the entire team for trying to thread a very tiny needle into a tremendous amount of work in a very short amount of time. And that needle is very, very tiny. Over the last several days, a lot of people in San Mateo County, both community leaders and elected leaders, have shared their thoughts with me about this. They have shared with me a lot of concerns, but as a
Oh, Director, now you're going in and out. We're losing you. Director G, we're not able to hear you at all now. Director G, we're unable to hear you.
We are open dialogue and look forward to 1,000 words that go behind the framework to get better.
Director G, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, but
Okay. We lost about half of what you were saying.
I was just saying there's a lot of people that are concerned about the framework in San Mateo County that have shared their thoughts with me, but I've looked forward to several thousand words that go behind the framework to add better definition to all the things that the directors have shared. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Director G. Director Pine, anything you want to offer?
A couple of thoughts. I find the proposal encouraging, and I think there's plenty in here for everyone to dislike. And certainly, as Director G and Stone, I've heard from plenty of San Mateo County leaders about concerns they have with this approach. But I think it's more important to focus on what's in here to like. And two of the major principles or needs of the parties that I've heard about since I've been on the board, I think are addressed here. From the beginning, there's been made clear by many that Caltrain needs to be able to hire and fire the CEO. And for the first time, we have this down here as a proposal that meets that objective. And then the ongoing necessity of repaying Samtrans, for a debt that's very, very old and for the longest time didn't seem to have any prospect of being paid, is also addressed. So while there's plenty of detail here to work out and plenty of specific clauses that can be challenged, I think at a high level it's going in the right direction.
Thank you, Director Pine. The next, if there is no other feedback, the next question on the table is, where do we go from here? What would the board like staff to do going forward? So in this last slide, we're asking for input from this group. Are you looking for the staff to take this feedback and come back with some refinements? Staff is also able to receive input on a different framework that may develop an alternative straw proposal. Both is possible. What would you like to see at this point? Director Hendricks.
Well, I think the simplest answer is staff, if everybody just agrees, we'll do what I want, then it'll be fine. But I don't think that's what we heard. What I think you heard through everybody's comments was it's really either call it A or B, but this is a starting point. You've heard various different comments from all of us of things that we'd like to have more information, or however you want to go ahead and characterize that, and that staff should continue to try and work in this by taking the information from today, further discussions with the GMs of the different agencies, and further feedback, if staff needs clarifying information from any of the direct board members, to be able to continue to try and find, a way to come to a workable agreement. And that's what I heard from the comments of everybody here. But
Thank you, Director Hendricks. Director Walton.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I'm just going to be brief. I think that whatever solution got proposed by this time should have really captured the intent of Resolution 2020-42. I could be on an island here, but I don't think the resolution was set up to create incremental change. I don't think that we had all the friction and back and forth that we had to come to the agreement on the resolution for something that wasn't really going to address governance as a whole. And that's what I thought was the intent. So I have to say that from the lens of at least my colleagues and folks that fought hard to come up with this resolution to really get us to a point where there were some governance changes. But with that said, I think that it's clear there is a lot of concern, and obviously there's some points that my colleagues think push us in the right direction. And so coming back with, I guess my statement is coming back with something that is in line with the resolution. And I know that's not, very precise, but that would be what I think should happen.
Thank you, Director Walton. Other comments? Director Davis.
I have a question about Glenn had brought something up as Director Hendricks, I'm sorry, had brought something up about the auditor. Michelle, can you comment on that? Because I thought we had selected an auditor.
I can. As to the exact date, Derek would be more informed, but we have selected an auditor separate for the JPB. That auditor has been in place, and in fact, the presentation on the ACFR that was received at the Finance Committee was the first official viewing of that new auditor in front of some form of the JPB board.
Okay, and I think the question about the auditor coming back to us with information about expenses of Caltrains that may support Samtrans and the extent to which those funds are kind of commingled, that I think that might be where the disconnect is we had asked for that and we don't understand when that's coming back. Which would be a separate report from my perspective than the annual report.
Chair Davis, I promised the board that I would talk to Derek about what was in the scope of what was completed. And I would talk to him about how we could complete an effort as was suggested, I think by Director Chavez last time. So I need to get back to you on that.
Okay.
And also, if I could just make a comment about the audit. So we did the JPB hired a new auditor. They started in January of 2021. They completed the audit, the annual audit. It was presented to the Finance Committee. As part of that audit, they do an analysis of the payment to the managing agency based on certain formulas and the number of hours worked by a number of individuals and so forth. It is a relatively common practice. And during the Finance Committee, we did ask the auditor about their review of that, and they did review it, and they said it was consistent with all of the standards. So if there is more work to be done in that arena, they do have a contract with the JPB, and that includes additional work beyond the regular annual audit that they can be requested to perform additional work in that arena, and then bring that back to the board if that's what the board wants. But they did complete that work, and they found that the amounts that have been paid for overhead and the allocation of positions based on the number of hours worked, et cetera, was accurate.
Thank you, Director Zmuda. Director Hendricks?
Yeah, since I asked this question, I think what it is that it'd be great if we saw what the auditor work plan was. And I think this is not just, are we having the auditor to look at just the one set of books? Do we now have an auditor that we as a board can go ahead and go, well, here, we want to have this looked at, or we want to have that looked at, which really goes to the idea of the work plan. So I don't have concern about, and I'm on the Finance Committee, and if I missed that, the auditor did that piece, that's shame on me. But it's not a question of, are we looking at the auditor for this narrow focus piece of work? But if we have an auditor, then we can go ahead and define what that overall work plan should be. And that's really more what I was trying to get to.
Great, thank you.
Realizing it's not an item part of this, so we're not trying to do it here. Let's do it in some other piece of work agenda.
Okay. Great. Director Zmuda, your hand is still up. Do you have other comments? Okay. Any other comments about what you would like to see staff do at this point?
Actually, I do have.
Yeah, Director Zmuda.
I have just a question. So is staff before the December meeting going to work on the interest calculation? Or when does that get done? Because I think that that's an important piece of this agreement, that we're going to want to know that amount prior to agreeing with it.
Yeah, and so I just want to be clear that there was an initial late proposal that was put on the table by Samtrans. It was not included in the agreement because there was no discussion about it amongst the other general managers, and I just did not want to share information that had not been vetted by the other general managers as something that would be shared today. So we will come back very soon with it. I think Director Hemminger's idea about developing, working with the general managers to develop options is going to be very important to that conversation.
Great, thank you.
Cindy's here.
I do see Director Chavez. I'm not sure if there's anything, Director Chavez, you would like to add as far as feedback, since we didn't hear from you then, or any suggestions as to what you'd like to see staff do at this point.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep my my camera off just so my bandwidth works. One thing I wanted to make sure of is that our staffs are all working together before this comes back to us in December. And what that means is that we get real meaningful input from all of our general managers that are part of the JPA, and that their thoughts are included. I have concerns about the proposal before us, but they're concerns that I've raised at meetings before, so they won't be new to any of my colleagues.
Thank you, Director Chavez. Just want to do a quick check. Michelle, do you feel like you have an idea of where you want to go from this point, or is there anything that's still a little fuzzy that you would like to get input from?
Well, fuzzy is a relative term. I just, first of all, I appreciate all the feedback that staff has gotten from the board. I think we have enough to go away, and I just want to be super clear. If I'm understanding the direction from the board, which is to go away, taking all of this feedback, and in conjunction with the general managers and other stakeholders, including follow-up discussions with board members as necessary, to come back with revisions to the straw proposal that more appropriately reflect what we've heard today. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is provide information to the board to help in its decision-making process. So that's really what we're looking to do here.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Director Davis.
Thanks. I would just add one thing, Michelle, with in areas where we haven't reached consensus. So kind of, you laid out a complete straw proposal. You could, if in area 3, I'm just throwing out a number, in area 3, if there's not a consensus, then we could have an option 1, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, so that we can talk about them specifically at the board level.
Absolutely, will do.
Great. So that concludes this portion of our discussion. I'll pass it back to Director Davis.
Thank you.